You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare.
Now, we all know about On War, and, most of us haven't read it. And I say us, and I actually mean you, listeners. But what else did Big Karl do, apart from die of cholera, a bit topical at the moment? He actually wrote quite a bit. There's other works he wrote, and there's been some other works out there for a while. But as we've always said on this show, how accessible are his works? G'day, listeners, and welcome to The Dead Prussian. Thanks again for tuning in and listening to the show. We really appreciate all the support on iTunes, on the charts, particularly on iTunes, and on Spotify. So we've hit top 100 in quite a few countries quite a few times over the past few months, which has been very, very helpful in generating a listener base. So please continue to listen, download, and if you can, review on great sites like the iTunes charts. All right, so we're going to talk about Karl today. Now, I had a bit of a stab at you all for not reading On War, but we know it's true. And I talked about how he wrote other works. But this is where I start to falter, being a Clausewitz fan, or at least a fan of what he was trying to do. I'm not going to say I always agree with Big Karl. But there are, strange enough, books that I have not read. And I guess if you're a regular listener to the show, you're probably well aware of that. But I can't talk about Karl's other works because I haven't read them. And a large part of it is because I also haven't necessarily found them that accessible. But my guest today has done us all a favour on one of his works. My guest today is Olivia A. Garard. She served as an active duty officer in the US Marine Corps from 2014 to 2020. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy from Princeton University in Princeton. That's in New Jersey for those people who don't know. And a Master of Arts in War Studies from King's College, London, the United Kingdom. Clausewitz tends to bind her motley thoughts together, and if for those who don't know, she's also quite a poet. So jump on the internet and Google Olivia A. Garard and poetry. Now, Olivia, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be back.
Now, Olivia, before we start discussing annotating some tactics, I'm really keen to learn what got you interested in the work of Big Karl himself, and also probably Marie Clausewitz as well. We could give her a shout out.
Well, I definitely have to give credit to Vanya Bellinger for really bringing Marie to the fore. But I came to Clausewitz through philosophy, actually. I had been interested in studying war in college, and so I took a bunch of courses in addition to the requirements that I had for philosophy on like grand strategy, philosophy of randomness and risk, and causes of war, all of which I had different elements of Clausewitz, and particularly on war. But it was always the Howard and Perret translation, and it was, very much the standard book 1, book 2, book 8, policy by continuation of policy by other means. And so it wasn't until I went to grad school at King's College in London where I had the opportunity to take a course on Clausewitz with Jan Honig, which was phenomenal because it was just an entire year to read all of On War, as well as the fact that we did it with the Graham translation. And so from that point on, I've been an ardent Clausewitzian.
Now, I would love to get into a discussion on which is the better translation of On War, Perret and Howard or Graham. It can be actually quite a fierce debate, listeners. And for those listeners that have had an audiobook version of On War, chances are it's the Graham retelling as opposed to the Perret and Howard. However, we don't have time for that. One, because I think I'll get schooled, and two, my translations are just out of reach. So let's talk about your book, which is excellent, by the way. So it's been making a bit of a buzz on Twitter by some of us older, more grayer individuals, because it's a sort of book I think a lot of us wanted when we were much younger, but didn't have the brains to do what you've done. Now it's called the Annotated Guide to Tactics, which is an annotated guide of Clausewitz's book, Guide to Tactics. And you took the Graham translation, from my understanding, of Clausewitz's work. But in annotating it, you've made it more accessible. You've made it something that junior military officers could probably pick up. Junior scholars, people doing their undergrads, their postgrads can pick up and have a read. Old and bold podcasters like myself can pick it up and go, right, now I get it. That's why that didn't work for me in Afghanistan. But it's one of the first such treatments in this way of a lesser known work of Clausewitz. One question I have, and some of the listeners might have, because we do every now and then bang on about how important On War is on this show. Why is this an important text?
So there's a few things, and I'm actually going to touch back on the translation, because that's, I think, part of why I was able to provide this. But what I think is so important about this is that it's theoretical instead of being specific and prescriptive of a lot of Napoleonic tactics. Because I think in military history, certainly tactics is something that you can focus on for a particular context, but it's not something that people generally think about or study in a very kind of abstract sense. It's very divorced from strategy. And that's not the way that Clausewitz talks about the relationship between tactics and strategy. Tactics is the set of possibilities that, is going to provide the tangible material that strategy is made out of. And so if we don't have, a robust understanding of what tactics is, especially today, where we're constantly dealing with new and evolving domains, if you want to call them that, or different areas that we have the potential to have conflict with our adversaries, if we don't have a really good theoretical underpinning of what it means to have a combat, what it means to be on the attack, what it means to have a fire combat, then we're setting ourselves up to transport a lot of very previous kind of historical models that makes it so that we kind of have to learn by experience without being able to take kind of a theoretical understanding and think through what may happen before it happens. Clausewitz always talks about having the balance between, gleaning information from history and being able to think through what is true from a theoretical perspective. But he also is working, and this I think is much clearer in Guide to Tactics, he's working from a very principled stance of what is the object of combat. Like, what are you actually trying to do? What does victory entail? What does it mean? Not in the sense of, this particular unit fighting this other particular unit, but what does victory actually mean? And so I think that is something that we are still wrestling with. And so that's what I have found particularly helpful, is he might not necessarily provide the correct, so to speak, answer for today, but I think the way that he wrestles with the questions is really helpful for as we start to think about, what do operations in the information environment look like in attack and defense? Is that even a meaningful way to conceive of it? And I think from the theoretical framework that Clausewitz brings, yes, it is. But if we bring a lot of kind of previous doctrine, I think it's somewhat unhelpful. And then to go back to my point about the translations, the Graham translation is actually how I found this text, is because most, for those listening, most are probably familiar with the White, Howard, and Perret translation. And the Guide to Tactics is not included in their translation. It's only included in the Graham translation. So the sheer fact of the popularity of the Howard and Perret translation is a large reason why no one knows about the no one knows about the Guide to Tactics, which is in the back of the Graham translation. I mean, as I said, I had the good fortune of studying Clausewitz, where we read all of On War, but we didn't read the appendices in the back. And so I finally, many years later went and I was like, oh, I should probably read all the appendices. And by the time I got to Guide to Tactics, I was just absolutely flabbergasted, because it was, coming from the United States Marine Corps, it read like MCDP-1 warfighting. It had the exact same kind of philosophy of warfare that the Marines were talking about. And it was Clausewitz, which was something that I wanted to bring up because then it can, for, as you mentioned, practitioners, especially junior leaders, and also junior scholars, it provides a way into thinking about the kind of underlying element that On War is all about, which is the combat or possible combats. And having basically a hyperlink that you can click down on and really understand, I think is really valuable.
It's interesting that the translation you read, you know, a lot of people understand this translation you read shapes your thoughts of a text, but if it may be very different from what the original may have been trying to convey to you, or if you have read it in the original. And you know, we both know Vanya, and the listeners know Vanya, and we know that she does a really good job of reading the stuff in the original German, and so therefore an understanding is different. And it's interesting in this case because the translation literally means whether or not you have access to the material, which I find fascinating. Now, interestingly, Clausewitz is a lot more succinct in this work, I found, than he is in his great tome. So I guess in that sort of context, how is this different, I suppose, from On War?
So I think there's a few things. One, it's formally different. Or one could look at, there's a few sections or a few chapters in On War that kind of mimic this same form, but it's shorter, more succinct, as you noted. It's divided into 28 sections and 604 propositions. So if you wanted to basically put a quote a day up, you could do it for a tour somewhere and get through the entire text, which is not something that you could do with On War. But as I said, it's just as theoretical. And so it's dealing with a lot of abstract questions about the object of combat, victory, offense and defense, destructive act, fire combat, close combat. But what's so interesting, I think, is that it moves in a very similar way, but without the historical grounding. So one of the key ways that On War works, and perhaps what makes it longer and harder to digest at points, is that he's always referencing a bunch of historical moments, particularly like very specific of Frederick the Great or of Napoleon. And there's very few historical references in Guide to Tactics. It's really just about what it is and what you're trying to do, and not as focused on whether or not he's able to correlate it to different historical moments.
And diving a little bit deeper into the text, he offers principles of combat in this text, and that's proof for the listeners that I've gone through and read the book. Are you able to provide our listeners an example of these principles and how they can inform, as you mentioned, you talked about information warfare and the modern challenges in competition and conflict. How can they inform the modern, I suppose, tactician and, I guess, from what I'm hearing today, the modern strategist?
So the section on principles of combat, I think for those who've read On War, should actually be reminiscent of Book 1, Chapter 1. There's a lot of similar elements. For instance, in Proposition 31, he writes, "This instinct to attack and destroy the enemy is the real element of war," which is something that you absolutely see. I believe it's Section 3 of Book 1, Chapter 1, where you're talking about some of the escalating elements of his definition. Or in Section 40, he talks about that because it is the collision of living physical and moral forces, they can only be estimated generally, which is something that is definitely found within On War, but it's something that I think we don't focus on enough, especially when we're thinking about net assessment and wanting to kind of come up with a military balance. And we're still, very much focused on what we can count, how many tanks they have, how many aircraft they have, how many weapons they have, and not, focusing on the moral force, which is something that Clausewitz doesn't have a clear section where he fully defines it, but you can definitely find within, talking about cohesion and order and courage. And, it's a combination of structure and emotions. that is something that is never fully definable. And so you run into this challenge of being able to try and figure out how do you make judgments when you can't have, a full measure of effectiveness to an extent, which is something that certainly when I was in the Marine Corps within the bureaucracy, that we always wanted, hard numbers that we can make decisions off of, and something that is found within Guide to Tactics and also found within certainly his Trinity and the rest of On War is balancing the reason or the a subordinate relationship to politics with the emotional element and also the chance element. And so having, that there are things that you can predict and control, and then there's also elements that are absolutely outside of your control and unpredictable because they're parts of the human element. And so, to again go back to how he defines principle versus maxim, which is found within On War. The principle is an objective quality, whereas a maximum is a subjective. And he's talking about both of these in different parts of it, but focused within the principles of combat these are kind of objective facts that about combat. And, for instance, he's definitely bringing up the hostility element, the unpredictability element. And so, for the really studious listener, they can definitely go back and see the kernels that develop into the more sophisticated rendering that happens in On War, which I think is why this is a really good text to begin with.
It's almost like a gateway drug to Clausewitz, I guess, in that sense. Although the show, I want to be clear, we do not recommend gateway drugs of any kind, but if we were going to recommend one, it would be this book. Now, Clausewitz also posits a couple of forms of conflict and relates them to the attack and the defense. And those Clausewitzians out there will definitely know about Clausewitz and the attack and the defense. Now, what are these forms of combat, and how does Big Karl relate them specifically to the attack and the defense?
So I'm going to talk about the two forms of combat first. So he describes fire combat and close combat. And obviously what he's thinking about is much more of, kind of a bayonet charge. That's, his model for close combat. And then artillery would be fire combat. But what's interesting about the way that he describes it is not based on a certain weapons, even though he brings up the kind of weapons of the day. He actually defines them based on knowledge. So close combat is defined by being more or less certain, i.e. if you're running at someone with a knife or a bayonet, you're pretty much certain that you're either going to cut and thrust, as he says, and you'll kill the adversary, or they're going to run away. So you're going to get that piece of land that you were looking to obtain. And so that's why there's a more certainty to that definition. Whereas he talks about for fire combat is more or less probable, in the sense that there's not necessarily a full expectation of what's going to happen. You may destroy their things, which can be valuable in and of itself, but it doesn't mean perhaps that they're going to run away or leave their position. They could very much hunker down. And so what I find so helpful in this is that, when we look at the kinds of technology we have today, traditional fires, especially if you're thinking in like a close air support context, actually kind of comes much closer to close combat in the way that Clausewitz has defined it in the sense, particularly if you're thinking of like a Hellfire missile, that's coming much more to the more or less certain. Whereas I would say that certainly operations in an information environment, certain types of cyber are going to be much closer to the fire combat in his, kind of more traditional, or in the way that he has rendered it, because there's a lot more probable effects that we don't necessarily know or expect are going to happen. And I think that that's, a far more helpful way of looking at the distinction between those two elements, because as we have more and more technologies, rather than trying to think, does this fit into the kind of traditional artillery realm, putting it in does this have a more or less certain effect, or does this have a more or less probable effect? And, certainly there's an argument to be made at where that, level of distinction would come. But that's, I think, really helpful because, and this gets into your aspect of the question with respect to the attack and defense. It's not, for certain, but defense tends to use more of the fire combat in Clausewitz's mind, and the attack tends to use more of the close combat, which makes a lot of sense. If you are trying to acquire something, if you have a positive object, then in order to really, take the hill, you're going to want to have a more or less certain outcome. And if you're if you're trying to preserve and your concern is more about making sure that the adversary doesn't take your hill, then destroying their things and just making sure that their life is miserable, and perhaps you can get them to give up. That's a far more salutary option for fire combat.
And just as an old gunner, I was really happy that he used fire combat, and you've almost ruined it for me, putting us in close combat. But I see the picture and it makes a lot more sense. However, he also talks about two acts of combat, and the combat consists of the destructive and the decisive act. What are the differences between these two?
So what's really interesting about the way that he brings up the destructive and the decisive act is actually how it ties into what he thinks of as victory. And he lays out 7 different ways that you can acquire victory. The first one is physical destruction of the adversary, which makes a lot of sense. But the next 6 are all mental states, that the adversary fears this, that the adversary believes this about the adversary. All of them are not necessarily directly related to not physically having the things to defend oneself. It's the belief that they don't have the ability to defend themselves for various different reasons. And so what you get into when you look at the destructive and the decisive act is destructive is exactly what you think. It's destroying, breaking, killing people. It's the, what we very simplify war as. The decisive act is actually the act that matters. That's the act where the adversary has given up the combat, has decided that they are going to leave the field, that they are going to, for this engagement, in the cost benefit of between, or the two profits and losses between the two, it goes to the other side, because that's what actually matters. And so when you get into the distinction with close combat and fire combat is really good at the destructive act. It's not as good at the decisive. It doesn't mean that you can't have a decisive act from fire combat. You could very well, in his case, have a bunch of artillery and have the other side decide to give up and leave, or basically concede. But what's interesting is with the close combat, the destructive act is actually not the point. And this, gets into the more or less certain, is that if you charge and they leave where they were standing, and you have now acquired what you wanted, that piece of terrain or whatever you were looking at for your objective, you don't have to destroy them for that to happen. And this, I think, goes back to the connection with the physical and moral force. If we're always so concerned with just the physical force in terms of the material and the personnel in terms of numbers, then you lose out on this large resource that can certainly augment either yourself or the adversary's capacity.
Now, Olivia, we could probably spend all morning my time, all afternoon your time, because I live in the future. I'm not saying the US is living in the past. In fact, I think Australia is living in the past in terms of vaccination rates at the moment. But we could probably spend a fair bit of time talking about Clausewitz, and I would probably just be peppering you with questions the whole time. But our listeners probably don't have time for that, and they are actually a key consideration. It's why I try and make my jokes so good, so that I keep the listeners listening. So we'll go to the bonus question for subscribers, and this is something that people who sign up to the TDP community and exist within our internal social media network that we run, they get access to this, and everyone else doesn't, because you don't give me any money. So we'll have a quick pause. And now that we've jumped back into the main channel for everyone to hear. There's just one point from the bonus question I wanted to talk about that you raised, and I don't normally do this for the cheapskate general public, but one thing you mentioned was the PDF and the hard copy. Now I've got the PDF and I've got my Apple Pen in my hand right now, actually, and I've scribbled notes all over it. I won't tell anyone what those notes are because I'm rather embarrassed about some of the things that have dawned on me. But there's a lot of room for annotating your annotated guide to tactics. And I know that Olivia is a big fan of marginalia. I am not. I'm one of those people that just cannot bring myself to put pen to a book unless it's a PDF. Then I go to town, right? And so one thing I really found valuable in this book is the space for notes, the space for taking your own notes as you go through it. This is not a book you read, put down, and walk away from. This is a text that you can take with you. And you mentioned its relative correlation with some Marine Corps doctrinal publications, in the same sense that a good doctrinal pamphlet that someone has got in their field kit should have notes all through it. This is kind of the same with your book. You're actually hoping people will deface your text.
That's absolutely. I encourage it. Kind of refer to it as a mental field exercise. So it's not something that you need to feel like you've necessarily gotten a very coherent thing out of it. It's more that the more time you spend with it, the more you're going to gain from it.
Now, Olivia, it's time for my final question, and it's one that I ask of all guests, and I asked this about you in our very first episode, which was years ago. In fact, it was very early on in the show's history, and it was a really cool topic. I'll let the listeners go back and try and find it. So they go back through the catalogue, download them all, guys. But this question relates to our mission on the show, which is to define war in as many ways as possible, to encourage the debate about war and its relevance and its effect on society. Just like Big Karl, the dead Prussian, did himself. You mentioned at the start, the classic definition that everyone quotes. Pick up the book and read through it, people. There's a lot more than that. He defines war several times throughout there. I don't think he was sure. Probably drove Maria mad, actually. Marie. Now, I ask each guest to finish a sentence. That sentence is war is. So right now, Olivia, I ask you to finish the sentence. War is.
So I think last time I used a quote, again, not the continuation of policy by other means, but war is not a field of stocks, that quote. But as I have two answers. First, I'm going to be really annoying for you, and I'm going to posit the entirety of book 1, chapter 1. I think that whole process of analysis is really his definition, even if he has section 2 as what he quote unquote says is his definition, but he's constantly revising and probing and playing with it and ends up in the Trinity. But I don't think the Trinity is necessarily his definition either. But there's a sentence that is within section 23 that I've actually really come to like, that I think encompasses a lot of what he's doing throughout the whole process of his interrogation of book 1, chapter 1. It is, therefore, in a certain measure, a pulsation of violent force, more or less vehement, consequently making its discharges and exhausting its powers more or less quickly. In other words, conducting more or less quickly to the aim, but always lasting long enough to admit of influence being exerted on it in its course, so as to give it this or that direction, in short, to be subject to the will of a guiding intelligence. What I love so much is just his repetitive caveating of more or less. It's more or less this, it's more or less that, it's more or less this, which I think war can always be.
Yeah, he's specific without being firm, I guess, in a way. He's not quite hedging his bets, but he's allowing the room for the reader to sort of understand, there's a grey area here. Although I'm not sure he would like the term grey zone warfare. I kind of hope he wouldn't, because I don't. Olivia, thank you very much for your definition. Thank you very much. I was a bit worried you're going to read all of book 1, actually. But thank you very much for your definition. Thank you very much for coming on the show. And most importantly, thank you very much for making Big Karl more accessible to readers.
Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Now, ladies and gents, please make sure you follow Olivia on Twitter. I do, at Tea and Tactics. That's tea as in the great English pastime, and tactics is pretty easy to understand. Check out Olivia's book. You can grab it at the MCU Press, and MCU Press is the Marine Corps University Press. You can jump on and grab a PDF copy of it. You can also request a hard copy. I dare say in the current global climate on deliveries, for those listeners outside the US, it might be just quicker to grab the PDF because it'll take you a couple of minutes, whereas the hard copies may take a while depending on what shipping route is used. We have more interesting guests coming up for you soon, listeners. 2021 has been as interesting as 2020, so I appreciate the flexibility you're all providing with our recording and publishing schedule. But until next time, listeners, grab the book and crack on.
Join the conversation with us on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod, on Facebook at the Dead Prussian page, or on our website www.thedeadprussian.com. All show notes for this episode, as well as copyright information, can be found on the website. The Dead Prussian podcast is written, produced and hosted by Mick Cook. It is co-produced by Amanda Levito. The music used throughout is Caught in the Beat by Broke for Free and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. All opinions expressed by individuals on the podcast are those of the individual and not necessarily representative of any other organisation.